Speaker, Mr. Ian Lees-Galloway tends to be a little shrill about a very complex matter of regulating drugs effectively that certainly the Labour government in 9 long years failed to do. But Mr. Speaker, no matter how Mr. Lees-Galloway's rants and raves, this is a complex area, and countries around the world are wrestling with the best and effective ways to minimise harm from psychoactive substances. And I must say, Mr. Speaker, that when the Select Committee heard submissions last year, New Zealanders up and down the country came to the Select Committee saying how they were deeply concerned for the children of New Zealand, the adolescents that were using them, because of the serious adverse effects, and none more so than the Mayor of Timaru, who came up to Wellington and said it was the #1 problem in her community of Timaru, and how the parents and the whole community were begging her to do something about it. After all, Mr. Speaker, the aim of the original legislation is to minimise harm from psychoactive substances and protect the public health. It was regarded as highly innovative legislation, and a huge amount of thought had been put into it. But as I said before, this is a very complex issue that no government I know of anywhere in the world has managed to get on top of. Mr. Speaker, I agree and accept that politically there is a very strong call for banning psychoactive substances. The reality is that it is under the circumstances where there is a danger that they will be driven underground, and it's a very real one. There is a danger that there is a concern that we must have the infrastructure and services available to look after those people who have withdrawal problems, and it is important to resource the police. There are several ironies relating to this legislation, and as John Rowan pointed out in the Herald, it was somewhat extraordinary that one would ban cannabis, and yet cannabinoids, synthetic cannabis, that is often many times more potent than the natural weed, was legal. So it's entirely appropriate that we are indeed addressing this issue. Mr. Speaker, one of the major tenets of this bill was that manufacturers are required to demonstrate minimal risk to humans who use so-called party pills or legal highs. And this legislation is indeed about risk management. However, to demonstrate minimal risk in 2014 does require the possibility of some animal testing, and we had huge debate in this House regarding that. The Expert Advisory Committee were absolutely clear that unfortunately, despite the rhetoric of the Greens and the anti-vivisectionists in 2014, there aren't substantive tests available that can demonstrate minimal risk. And Professor Robson from the Expert Advisory Committee, Professor Gluckman and the Ministry of Health all acknowledge that to be the case, and that it may be several years before we have alternatives that are effective to demonstrate minimal harm. However, in the meantime, we are doing the appropriate thing in taking psychoactive substances off the shelves. But, Mr. Speaker, I do want to mention that there are some wider safety, scientific and economic issues at stake around the passing of this bill, because there is no doubt in my mind that if New Zealand is to say that science is at the centre of government, and we are going to continue to have high standards around the medicines and drug we use. It's fundamental to insist these medications undergo rigorous testing according to best practice scientific methods, which today, as I've said, does indeed require, to the best of our knowledge, animal testing. We hope indeed that this can be replaced, and the legislation was very clear that it should be minimised if indeed it was needed. We hope that technology will advance rapidly and allow it not to be unnecessary. But, Mr. Speaker, the erosions of these principles in the pharmaceutical and biological engineering field can lead to the erosions of standards and of opportunities in the health sector, in the agricultural sector, in the biosecurity sector, and in the innovative sector. And I remember well, Mr. Speaker, the debates around the IRMA and HASNO legislation some years ago, where the Greens wanted to exercise the precautionary principle to the zenith degree, with the result that New Zealand's capability and capacity in the area of biotechnology has been reduced. And this does mean a reduced capability in the agricultural and biosecurity area. But, Mr. Speaker, it is also ironical that the Greens indeed talk about this precautionary principle for offshore drilling and indeed, as I say, in the biological engineering area. But when it comes to party pills, they are not so worried about the standards that are used. And these pills are indeed used, or substances are used on adolescents, developing brains, when they are at their most sensitive. So, Mr. Speaker, there is no doubt that this amendment bill is a practical response to the fact that ordinary New Zealanders up and down the country do not want psychoactive substances to be available legally, and I feel very strongly that the House is supporting this bill, and it is an irony that the Greens are abstaining.
The Honourable Annette King.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Labor will support